The morning the housekeeper fell ill, it was Eleanor Vance who carried the slate of bad news up the great staircase of Harrowmere. And the Duke of Harrowmere did not so much as turn from the window when she entered. She was the understeward's daughter, kept on for her hand with figures and her plain voice, and the room had long since decided what she was. A clerk in a grey gown. A girl who counted what the great house could no longer afford. She stood at the threshold with the ledger held against her ribs, and read him the 3 things the estate could not survive, and he listened to none of it, and a thing in her chest that she had buried 2 winters ago turned over once and lay still again. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulder, his dark coat buttoned to the throat against a fire he had not let them light, and his face, when he finally moved, was still as ice over a river. The world said the Duke of Harrowmere had not spoken a kind word since his wife went into the ground. The world said he heard nothing, wanted nothing, and would let the great estate rot around him like a man content to be buried with it. Eleanor had believed the world. She had no reason yet to believe anything else. If you have ever stood in a cold room and told the truth to a man who would not look at you, stay with me. You will want to see how this one ends. She had been reading him bad news for 19 mornings. The grain factor would not extend the note. The roof over the east wing had failed in the autumn rains, and the lead was wanted elsewhere. 2 of the tenant farms had gone to the wall, and a 3rd would follow by the spring planting if nothing changed. Each morning she climbed the stairs with the ledger, and laid the figures before him in her flat, careful voice, and each morning he stood at the window with his back to her, and let her finish, and said only, "That will be all." As though the words were weather. As though she were weather. She had stopped expecting him to answer. She had not stopped, she found, climbing the stairs. Eleanor was 24, slight, with the kind of plainness the season prized in a governess and overlooked in everyone else. Her father had served the late Duke for 30 years and had died owing money he had borrowed to keep a roof over her. And the present Duke had let her stay, because no one had thought to tell him she was there. She wore the same 2 grey gowns, turned and returned. She kept the household books in a hand so clean, the solicitor had once held a page to the light, and asked who had taught her. Her father, she had said. She did not tell the solicitor that her father had also taught her to play the small pianoforte in the cold gallery, or that she had not touched it since the 2nd funeral, the one no one but she had attended. The wound she carried was a simple one, and she never named it. Even to herself she had once been told by a man she had trusted enough to half-love that she was easy to leave because there was nothing in her worth the trouble of staying. His name had been Mr. Holloway, and he had been the late Duke's land agent for a single season, and he had courted her through a wet spring with borrowed poetry and his mother's good opinion. And Eleanor had let herself believe in him because she had been young and her father had been dying, and a girl in that position will believe in a warm hand on a cold day. Then a banking family in Bath had offered him a daughter with £3,000, and he had taken the offer, and he had told Eleanor the reason to her face, as though he were doing her a kindness by being honest. There was nothing in her, he had said, worth the trouble of staying for. He had married the heiress in Bath, and Eleanor had folded that sentence into a small hard square and put it somewhere under her breastbone, and she had built her quiet life on the certainty that he had been right. She did not expect to be chosen. She expected to be useful and then to be forgotten. In that order, and she had made her peace with the order. A useful woman is never cold and never warm. She is only needed until she is not. And Eleanor had decided that needed was a great deal more than most people in her position were given, and that she would be grateful for it and ask for nothing more. She rose each morning before the kitchen, broke the ice on the water in her room, and dressed in the dark by feel. She knew the household accounts the way a sexton knows the names on his stones, by long familiar sorrow. She knew which farms were behind, and by how much, which servants had not been paid their full wage since Michaelmas, and had stayed on out of loyalty to a house that could no longer deserve it, which tradesmen in the village had begun to send their bills twice. She carried all of it in her clean, clear hand, and in her flat, clear voice, and she had grown so accustomed to being the bearer of what no one wished to hear that she had half forgotten she had ever been a girl who played the pianoforte for the joy of it in a warmer house. The dowager came to Harrowmere in the 3rd week of Eleanor's reading, and the house changed its breath. Lady Margaret Harrowmere was the late Duke's sister, a tall woman who wore her late husband's mourning still and her own authority, like a second set of jewels. And she had come, she said, to see her nephew restored to the world. She meant a wife. She had brought one with her in the carriage, a Miss Cordelia Ashe, all pale gold hair and ice blue silk, the daughter of a banking family whose money could mend the roof and buy the lead and silence the grain factor in a single afternoon. The dowager surveyed the cold great hall and the threadbare runners and the understeward's daughter in her grey gown, and she did not lower her voice when she spoke. "Send the clerk away," she said to the butler, with a small motion of her fan toward Eleanor. "My nephew does not need a girl reciting ruin at him every morning. He needs a wife with a dowry and a steward who will not weep over the accounts. That one is neither." The butler, who was an old man and had known Eleanor's father, looked at the floor. Eleanor stood very still in the doorway, with the ledger against her ribs, and felt the old cold square under her breastbone. Press once hard against the inside of her chest, she did not weep. She had long since stopped weeping where anyone could see. She gathered the ledger and turned to go. And as she turned, she saw that the Duke, who had stood at the head of the hall through all of it with his back half to the room, had gone entirely still. Not the stillness of a man who had not heard. The stillness of a man who had heard every word. She did not understand it. She was not meant to understand it. That was the engine of the whole long winter, and the listener understood it before Eleanor did. For 2 days, the dowager and Miss Ashe took the warm rooms and the late breakfasts and the Duke's silent attendance at dinner, and Eleanor kept to the cold offices below stairs with the books. She heard from the kitchen that the banking family wished the matter settled by the new year. She heard that the dowager had ordered fires lit in rooms that had stood cold since the Duchess died, and that the Duke had let her, which the house took as the beginning of his surrender. Eleanor took it the same way. She had no reason not to. She wrote out the quarter's hopeless figures by candlelight, and told herself it did not matter to her whom the Duke married. And her hand, writing, was steady. And the steadiness was a kind of lie. She had grown skilled at telling. On the 4th morning she did not climb the stairs because the dowager had forbidden it. Instead, she took the orphaned boy. His name was Thomas, and he was the gardener's grandson, 6 years old. And small for it, left to the great house when his mother went to service in London and never sent for him. He had a cough that had frightened the kitchen all autumn, a thin, rattling thing that came worst in the gray hour before dawn, and he was afraid of the dark gallery where the cold pianoforte stood, because the gallery was hung with the portraits of dead Harrowmares, and a child cannot be told that the painted dead mean him no harm. Eleanor had found him there one early morning, pressed into a corner beneath the largest of the portraits, too frightened to cry, and she had not sent him back to the kitchen. She had sat down at the instrument instead, the first time she had touched it in 2 years, and she had played the simplest of her father's airs, until the boy crept out of his corner and came to stand beside the bench. After that, it became a thing between them. On the mornings she could not sleep, which were most mornings, she took him to the gallery at first light, and played the few quiet pieces her father had taught her, until the fear went out of his small shoulders, until the painted Harrowmeres were only paint, until the cough eased, and the boy's eyes grew heavy, and the gray window went gold. She did not think anyone heard. The gallery was at the end of the east wing, above the failed roof, where no one went. She played for the boy because the boy was afraid, and because her hands remembered more than she had given them credit for, and because in that 1 half-hour each day she was not a clerk, reciting ruin, but only a woman making a small, warm thing for a child who had been left, as she had been left. She told him between the airs, small, true things, that the dark was only the room with the candles out, that his mother in London thought of him, which she did not know to be true but said anyway, because some lies are a kind of mercy. That a person could be small and frightened and still be brave, because brave was not the absence of fear, but the playing on through it. She did not know she was describing herself. She would not have believed it if she had. The Duke stood in the gallery doorway that morning and listened to all of it, and Eleanor did not see him until the piece was done. She rose fast, the boy's hand in hers, an apology already forming, because she had been told to keep below stairs, and here she was in the family wing with a kitchen child. At the family instrument. The Duke, though, did not look angry. He looked at the boy, and then at her hands still resting on the keys, and then at her face. And his own face had a thing in it she had not seen there before and could not read. It was the look of a man who had heard music in a house he believed had gone silent forever. Who taught the boy not to be afraid, he said. It was not quite a question. His voice was low and level, and it did not sound like the voice that said, "That will be all." No one taught him. "Your Grace," Eleanor said. "He is still afraid. I only sit with him until the morning comes." He was quiet for a moment. Thomas had pressed himself against her skirts and was watching the Duke with enormous eyes, and the Duke crouched, which Eleanor had not known he could do, and looked at the boy on the boy's own level, and said, "There is nothing in this room that will harm you. You may come and play here whenever you wish." Then he straightened and looked at Eleanor over the child's head and said, "You will continue. That is not a request." And he turned and went, and Eleanor stood with her hand on the boy's hair, and her heart going hard against her ribs in a way she had no name for and did not want to find one. That was the first of the commands she misread. There would be a winter of them. The Dowager's campaign sharpened after that. She could not have said why, only that something in the house had shifted under her. Some current she could feel and not see, and like all people whose power has never failed them, she met the unfamiliar with more of the familiar. She arranged for Miss Ashe to be always in the warm rooms when the Duke passed through them. She spoke of the wedding as a settled thing in the Duke's hearing and out of it. And when the Duke did not contradict her, she took his silence as consent, which it had always been before, and she found new occasions to remind the house of what Eleanor was. "A steward's girl with clever fingers," she said one evening to Miss Ashe, in the long drawing-room with the doors open and Eleanor passing in the corridor with an armful of the household linen. Useful. I grant you in the way a good lock is useful. You do not invite the lock to dinner. My nephew has indulged a sentiment, because the creature plays a little sentiment is not a foundation for a house. Eleanor walked on with the linen and did not slow. The square under her breastbone pressed and held. Yet the Duke, who sat by the fire with a book he was not reading, set the book down on the table beside him with a sound just slightly too loud for the quiet room. And the Dowager glanced at him, and for the first time that winter something flickered behind her certainty, there and gone. Here is a thing the heroine could not see, and the listener could. He had begun to attend the mornings again. Not the figures, her. The set of her shoulders when she read him the worst of it. The way she never once asked him for anything, not warmth, not pity, not even an answer. Only delivered the truth and let him do with it what he would. He had married once, a woman who had asked him for everything and forgiven him nothing, and he had failed her in 100 small ways and one large one, and he had buried her believing that he was a man who broke whatever leaned on him. Eleanor leaned on nothing. She came each morning and told him the house was dying, and asked him for not one thing. And a man who believes himself ruinous finds, in a person who needs nothing from him, the only safe place he has ever been allowed. The midpoint of that winter came on a gray afternoon in the failed East Wing, where Eleanor had gone to measure the damage for the solicitor's report, and the Duke found her there with the rain coming through the broken slates onto the floor. She had not heard him on the stair. He stood in the doorway a long moment, watching her crouched over her measuring line in the wet, And when he spoke, his voice was not level at all. "My wife died in this wing," he said. Eleanor went still. He had never once spoken of her. She was ill a long time, and I was in London a long time, raising money to mend a roof, and the morning she asked for me I did not come, because the grain factor was difficult and I believed there would be other mornings. There were not. He looked at the rain on the floor. I have not let them light a fire in this house since. It seemed a thing I had no right to. He took something from the breast of his coat, then a small thing wrapped in a square of gray silk, and he did not show it to her, only held it, his thumb moving once across the silk. Eleanor knew without being told that it was a likeness of the dead Duchess, and that he carried it always, against the side where the heart is, and that this was the wound the whole cold house had been built around. He wrapped it again and put it away. "You read me ruin every morning," he said, "and you do not look away from it, and you do not ask me to feel better about it." I had forgotten a person could do that. He was quiet. The rain came down. "That will be all," he said. But the words had changed entirely, and they both heard it. She did not tell him then that her own father had died in a cold room asking for no one. She did not tell him that she understood exactly the arithmetic of the morning that did not come. She only gathered her measuring line and stood, and on her way past him, she did a thing she had not planned, and could not afterward explain. She laid her hand for one moment against his sleeve, the way one lays a hand on a frightened child in a dark gallery, and she said, "There will be other mornings, Your Grace. Let them light the fire." And she went. And the Duke stood in the wet ruin of the wing where his wife had died, and pressed his hand flat against the place in his coat where the likeness lay, and did not move for a long time. If this is the kind of story you keep coming back to, you already know what it cost her to touch his sleeve. Stay with me. The cost is not paid yet. That evening the fires were lit in the great hall for the first time in 2 years, and the house did not know what to make of it, and the Dowager knew exactly what to make of it and did not like it at all. She watched the warmth come up in rooms that had been cold since her sister-in-law died, and she understood that she was losing a thing she had assumed could not be lost, and she made her decision the way confident people make decisions, quickly and without doubt. She would settle the matter before the new year, with or without her nephew's attention. She summoned the banking family to Harrowmere for a betrothal dinner, and she did not tell the Duke until the carriages were a day away. In the days before the dinner, the proximity between Eleanor and the Duke grew into a thing neither of them named, and both of them felt in the body, before the mind would permit it. He found reasons to be where she was. He came to the gallery in the mornings, and stood at the back while she played for Thomas, and once he asked her, low, to play a particular air, and she did, and it was an air the dead Duchess had loved. And when she finished, he said nothing for a long while, and then said only, "Thank you," which was a word the Dowager had never once heard him say. He began to take his breakfast in the cold office where Eleanor kept the books, on the pretext of the accounts, and they would sit across the narrow table in the gray light and not speak, and the not speaking was warmer than any room in the house. Once their hands reached for the same ledger and stopped an inch apart, and neither moved, and Eleanor felt her own pulse in her throat, and the Duke looked at her hand beside his on the table, as though it were a thing he was not permitting himself, and the inch between them held all the heat the lit fires could not match. "I should not be here," she said once, meaning the office, meaning the inch, meaning all of it. "You are the only person in this house I can bear to be near," he said level, looking at her. And it was not a gallant speech. It was a plain, hard fact, stated by a man who did not lie, and it undid her, more than any gallant speech could have done. She did not answer it. She could not. The square under her breastbone had cracked along one edge, and she was afraid of what was behind it. There was a morning after that when the snow had come in the night, and the office was colder than usual, and the Duke came in and saw her hands stiff and white over the page, and did not say a word about it. He went out. She thought she had displeased him. He came back with a shawl, a heavy gray wool thing that had been his mother's, the old Duchess who had died when he was a boy, and he set it around Eleanor's shoulders himself, his hands at the back of her neck for one moment, as he settled it, and then he sat down across the narrow table and opened the ledger as though nothing had happened. "You will keep that," he said. "I cannot have my steward's fingers freeze before the quarter is reckoned." It was a command, and it was an insult to the warmth in it, calling her his steward. And Eleanor understood by now that this was the only way he knew to be tender, to wrap the care inside an order so that neither of them had to look at it directly. She kept the shawl. She wore it every cold morning. It smelled faintly of cedar and of a house that had once been warm, and when she put it on she felt, for the first time in years, that someone had thought of her body and its cold as a thing worth mending. And the feeling was so unfamiliar that the first morning she wore it, she had to stop on the stair and press the back of her hand hard against her mouth until it passed. She knew the shape of the thing now. She had begun, against every law of sense she had set for herself, to want him. Not his rank, which frightened her, and not his house, which was dying, but the man himself, the grief he carried wrapped in gray silk, the way he crouched to a frightened child, the way he listened now to every word. She read him. She wanted him the way the body wants warmth after a long cold, helplessly and without permission, and she lay awake in her narrow room above the kitchen and named it to herself at last, the want. And then she folded it into a square and put it under her breastbone with the other one, because she was a steward's daughter, and he was the Duke, and the banking carriages were already on the road. The betrothal dinner was the dowager's masterpiece, and the heroine's dark hour, and it happened in the great hall where the fires now burned, with 30 guests at the long table, and Miss Ashe in ice-blue silk at the Duke's right hand, and Eleanor nowhere. Because the dowager had arranged that the understeward's daughter should serve at the side table, where the household accounts were kept ready in case any gentleman wished to discuss the estate. It was a cruelty, dressed as practicality, and it was the more cruel for being so well dressed, because Eleanor could not refuse it without seeming to put herself above her station, which was precisely the trap the dowager had built. She stood at the side table in her gray gown among the silver and the candlelight, and the warm laughter of people who had never once been cold, and she watched the Duke seated beside the woman his aunt had chosen, and she watched Miss Ashe lay her pale gloved hand near his on the cloth. And she understood that she had let herself believe something a steward's daughter has no business, believing the shawl was upstairs on the back of her office chair. She had not dared to wear it here. The understanding was worse than the cold square, worse than the man in Bath, worse than anything she had ever folded away, because the others she had at least seen coming, and this one she had let grow in her like warmth. And warmth that is taken away leaves a colder room than one that was never warm at all. The dowager rose to make the announcement. She was magnificent. She thanked the banking family, and she spoke of 2 great houses joined, and she lifted her glass toward her nephew and Miss Ashe, and then, because she was a woman who finished her work thoroughly, she turned her gaze to the side table, and she made certain the room saw where she looked. "And we shall have order restored in this house at last," she said, smiling, to the whole bright table. "No more ledgers carried about by a girl who imagines that counting a man's debts gives her some claim on the man. The clerk may go back below stairs after tonight. The Duchess of Harrowmere will keep her own accounts, and they will not be kept in a gray gown." The room laughed, lightly, the way a room laughs when those with rank make a joke at the expense of those without it, and Miss Ashe smiled into her glass, and the candle flame stood up straight in the still warm air. Eleanor set down the account book she had been holding, very gently, so that it made no sound, and she looked at the Duke once, the way one looks a last time at a window one is leaving, and she turned to go from the hall. She had reached the door when his voice stopped the room. "No," said the Duke of Harrowmere, and he stood. He did not raise his voice. He had never in his life needed to raise his voice. He set down his glass, and he stood at the head of the table where his wife's empty place had been for 2 years, and the whole bright room turned to him, and the dowager's smile held one instant too long, and then began very slightly to fail at the edges. He looked down the length of the table at his aunt, and at Miss Ashe, and at the banking father. And then he looked past all of them to the gray figure stopped at the door, and he came around the end of the table and crossed the long hall toward her in the silence, 3 strides, and then more. Past the diamonds and the ice blue silk and the 30 turned faces, and he stopped in front of Eleanor Vance, where she stood at the threshold she had been about to cross. "This house has read its own ruin aloud, every morning for a season," he said to the room, without turning from her, "and only one person in it ever told me the truth, and asked me for nothing. I will not announce a marriage to a stranger across her shoulder." Then to Eleanor alone, low, the words level and irrevocable, and 12 in number, he said the thing he had not said before and would not say again. "Marry me." I have heard every word. The silence after held the whole room. Somewhere along the table a glass was set down without being drunk from. The dowager had risen halfway, and now sank back into her chair, and her fan, which had ruled the house all winter, lay closed and forgotten in her lap. Miss Ashe looked at the banking father, and the banking father looked at the dowager, and the dowager looked at her nephew, crossing back to no one, standing in the middle of his own warm hall beside a girl in a gray gown, and she understood, finally and completely, that her script had worked everywhere in her long life, except here, in this house. On this night, against this quiet creature she had mistaken for a lock, Eleanor could not speak. The square under her breastbone had broken entirely, and the thing inside it was too large for the room. She looked up at him and saw that he was afraid, the Duke himself, afraid as she was. A man who believed he broke whatever leaned on him, asking her plainly in front of everyone to lean. And she found that the only true thing she could give him was the truth, which was the thing she had always given him. "You will have other mornings, Your Grace," she said, and her voice was not flat at all now. "All of them, if you wish it." "I wish it," he said. The old butler at the door, who had known her father, turned his face away so the room would not see what was in it. Thomas, who should have been asleep above the kitchen, was watching from the servant's stair in his nightshirt, and no one sent him away. The solicitor, who had come for the betrothal and stayed for something he had not expected, would later set the marriage settlement in order so thoroughly that neither the dowager nor the banking family nor any cousin yet unborn could unmake it, and the Duke would settle on Eleanor in her own name a sum that made her independent of him forever, which is the only kind of asking a proud woman can bear to say yes to. All of that came later. On the night itself there was only the warm hall, and the quiet between 2 people who had each believed themselves unchoosable, and the dowager gathering the wreck of her certainty with a dignity Eleanor would later, when she could afford to, find it in herself to pity. They were married in the small estate church in the new year, with snow on the stones and no crowd at all, only the household, and the boy and the old butler and the solicitor, which was the wedding Eleanor would have chosen if anyone had ever thought to let her choose. The dowager did not come to the church. She came instead, 3 days after, to the warm gallery where Eleanor sat at the pianoforte, and she stood in the doorway a long while, an old woman in her late husband's mourning, and at last she said stiffly, the nearest thing to an apology her whole life had left her able to say, "He smiles now, he did not smile before. I had thought a dowry would mend the house. I did not think to consider that the house wanted mending in a part no money reaches." Eleanor rose and crossed to her, and did not gloat and did not flinch, and the 2 women looked at each other, and something between them settled, not into love, but into a kind of armistice that would last, and that was enough. The east wing was mended by spring, the lead bought, the grain factor paid, the failing farms set right, not by a banking fortune, but by a duke who had begun, at last, to attend to his own house. He rode out to the farms himself, in the thaw, which no Harrowmere had done in living memory, and he sat at the tenants' tables and listened to them, the way he had learned to listen, and the rents that had been impossible became possible once the man who set them had seen with his own eyes the fields they came from. Eleanor went with him on the dry days, and the tenants who had known her as the girl who carried the bad news came to know her as the Duchess who remembered their children's names and the exact figure of what was owed and forgave none of it that could be paid and all of it that could not. The roof over the gallery held through the spring rains. The fires stayed lit. The old butler who had turned his face away at the threshold on the night of the dinner stood a little straighter that year, and once, finding Eleanor alone in the office over the books, he set down beside her a small packet of letters her father had written to him, across 30 years of service, so that she might have them, so that she might know. He said that her father had spoken of her in every one. Thomas lost his cough by midsummer and grew bold enough to play under the long windows where his grandfather worked the beds, and he was never again afraid of the dark gallery, because the dark gallery had become the warmest room in the house. It was an evening the following winter, with the snow coming down soft past the tall gallery windows, and the fire steady in the grate, that the thing came full circle. Eleanor sat at the small pianoforte playing one of her father's quiet airs, and Thomas lay along the warm hearthrug with a book he was too sleepy to read, and the Duke of Harrowmere stood behind her with his hand resting on her shoulder, and he took from the breast of his coat the small thing wrapped in grey silk. He unwrapped it this time. It was the likeness of his first wife, as Eleanor had known it would be, and he looked at it a long moment in the firelight, without grief now, only with the quiet a man keeps for a debt he has finally found a way to honor. Then he set it, not back against his heart, but open on the mantel above the fire, in the warm room, in the light, where it could see the snow falling on the window the house had reclaimed. She would have wanted the fires lit, he said. Eleanor's hands had stopped on the keys. She left the air unfinished, the way a thing is left when there will be a tomorrow to finish it in. And she leaned back against him, and the snow came down past the bright window, and the boy slept on the hearthrug in the warm gallery where no one was afraid anymore, and the likeness on the mantel kept its quiet watch over the lit and living house. She had carried bad news up that staircase for a whole long winter. Certain she was nothing in the room but the voice that counted what was lost. She had been wrong about what she was. It had only taken a man learning, at last, how to listen. Thank you for staying until the end. If Eleanor's long winter moved you, sit with it a moment before you go, and carry it gently into yours.